The world is becoming increasingly proficient at telling stories that deny God. As such, we need Thinking Christian to become as natural as breathing. Welcome to the Thinking Christian podcast. I'm Dr. James Spencer. Through calm, thoughtful, theological discussions, Thinking Christian highlights the ways God is working in the world and questions the underlying social, cultural, and political assumptions that hinder Christians from becoming more like Christ. Now, on to today's episode of Thinking Christian. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Thinking Christian. I'm Dr. James Spencer, and I am joined today by Dr. Tamar Oostrom. She is an assistant professor at The Ohio State University and one of the authors on a paper that's called Deaths of Despair and the Decline of American Religion. And so while that may sound like a really upbeat topic, we're going to be talking about her research a bit and just trying to understand what the implications of certain blue laws are for this discussion. So really appreciate you being on the show. Tamar, welcome.
Thanks for reading my paper.
Yeah, absolutely.
What someone does. Yeah.
It feels good, doesn't it? So why don't we start here? Why don't you give us just kind of an overview of what the paper's about and just that broad summary, and then we'll dig into some of the points.
Okay. So we were interested in this question of to what extent has religiosity affected this increase in what some people call deaths of despair, deaths due to suicide, alcohol overdoses, and drug overdoses. So the broad picture is basically like, does religion, community ties, things like that, does that affect health? And so what evidence can we bring to that topic?
Is it in the vein? So, I mean, I've read the paper, and some of the things that sort of echoed for me were bowling alone. You know, this sort of idea that as the culture's institutions tend to decline a little bit and crumble a little bit, that you start to lose a sense of meaning and self and identity, and then these things are more likely. Is that the way you're arguing, or is there something more complex about it?
I think that's like the hypothesis that we're considering. You know, like a lot of people have speculated that like your connections matter for your happiness, for your like life expectancy, and this is sort of one way of testing that empirically.
Okay. And maybe one other question before we dive into the article. Economics. So I've read Daniel Kahneman's stuff, and I know he was an economist, but I really don't know what that means. So can you talk about your field a little bit, your background, and just give people a context for why this topic would arise out of economics?
Yeah, why is this an economics paper? Why is this part of my job description? Yeah, that's a great question. So economics is so much broader than I thought it was when I took like Eco 101 and had some supply and demand curves and was like, honestly, this is very boring. Which I didn't realize until many years after that. So economics is just like the study of like scarce resources, which is like anything. So we as economists have interpreted that super broadly to apply to things like, I'm a health economist. So I study things like incentives in pharmaceutical innovation, thinking about sort of, drivers of these like opioid overdoses. I have other things on like, why do people get mammograms? It's just anything that's like about people making decisions under constraints, which there's always constraints in the real world, is economics. And we've become quite imperialistic kind of in like the sorts of topics that economists study. I think the one thing that ties these papers together is sort of the way economists think about these problems and like the toolkits that we use. Yeah.
So in this paper, just from my reading of it and based on that description of economics, it's actually really helpful. So it feels like the constraint that's lifted off are what you call these blue laws. And once those constraints are lifted off, then people are freer maybe to make other choices. And these other choices have implications down the road that aren't immediately obvious, but that now ultimately sort of grow out of a meta-analysis of all this research, and you can see a trend there. Is that Is that a right way to think of it?
That's a great way of thinking about it. Basically, like the broader question is sort of like, why have there been all of these deaths of despair?
Right.
What decisions are people making? Sort of what are their economic and environmental constraints? And then this paper is like thinking about, yes, like what if we change, the in this case, like people's tendency to go to church.
Yes.
What consequences does that have?
And what consequences does that have? So talk a little bit about the blue laws. I've referenced it a few times, but I thought that was a really interesting part of the paper. And then I've got some follow-up questions just to clarify in my own mind, maybe what's associated with the blue laws. But go ahead and describe what a blue law is and kind of help people understand how that interacts with your study.
Yes. So blue laws are just general prohibitions on retail activity, usually on Sundays. So this idea is that the grocery store used to be closed on Sundays. I'm Dutch, still like in Holland and many European countries, you can't buy like milk or anything on Sundays. So that's sort of just like laws regulating commerce on certain days of the week, usually for sort of religious reasons. So why you might sort of not be familiar with this term is that like currently most states sort of don't have these restrictions. So in the 1960s and 70s, almost all states had some version of these laws. And then over the time period that we study, sort of in like the 70s and 80s into the 90s, most states repeal these laws. So then you could go shopping on Sunday. You could do something, arguably more fun than going to church. These constraints are lifted. Yes.
Yeah, because I think I can remember times when I was younger. So I was born in 1977.
Perfect for the study. Amazing. Firsthand.
Yeah. Yes. When I got older and I could shop, I can still remember going to the store and seeing people not be able to buy alcohol. I wasn't old enough to buy alcohol at the time, but you could go to the store, but then there were certain, even within those stores, there were restrictions like you couldn't buy alcohol before noon, let's say.
Okay.
I can remember those rules being there.
Yes.
So yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I do want to make a distinction that there's sort of two sort of types of laws. There's laws on like, can the store be open? And there's laws on like, can alcohol be sold? The laws that we study are, can the stores be open? So they're not directly about alcohol. And actually a lot of states still have alcohol laws in the books. I went to like grad school in Massachusetts where you couldn't buy alcohol, I think, before some time on Sunday, which, was not a part of my life until suddenly I'd be like, oh no, I have to wait 5 minutes to like buy this bottle of wine. Yes. So we are not directly studying changes in these alcohol laws.
Okay.
And usually there's sort of separate laws on the books for those two things.
So that's interesting. So that was one of my questions, right. Like how were those connected? So I'm glad we got through that. Then my next question then is the connection between just being able to go shop, moving away from church, and then having this increase in deaths of despair becomes really harder for me to conceptualize because, you can almost draw a straight line conceptually without looking at any data. You could go, well, yeah, people now could buy alcohol on Sundays. And so obviously there's going to be more of this or there's going to be more of that. But if it's just the stores being opened and you can buy whatever it is that you'd like, and all you're doing is staying away from church, it's a more complex situation to understand why these other deaths are happening. So talk about how you navigate that in the study.
Yeah. So like what's going on? So the first thing is that some other papers have looked at these law changes and found, like we do, that when you sort of give people more opportunities to do other things on Sunday, they do. They like go shopping, they like do other things. And then this reduces church attendance and like affiliation. So people are sort of less likely to go, say, weekly. And they're also more likely to report they have sort of like a weak affiliation with the church. So this is changing like behavior And like a little part of this is like also some part of like identity, or like, do you see yourself as someone who regularly attends church? Is that an important part of how you would describe yourself? And so then the question is like, what would sort of the downstream consequences of like that be, and why would that affect death despair down the road? And like, that's like what we see. So I haven't actually quite gotten into like what the identification is in this paper. Basically, different states repealed these laws at different times. And you can see after states repealed the laws that a couple years later, deaths due to these sort of deaths of despair increase in those states, and then they don't increase in the states where like these laws didn't change.
Okay.
So,
so you'd use the states where the laws didn't change as almost like a control group.
Exactly. Yes.
And then as you saw a difference between the states that released those laws, got rid of them, then you're able to see significant differences between deaths of despair in a state that still had the laws versus deaths of despair that didn't have the laws.
Yes. So it's like a treatment versus control straight, and then also like the timing of those law changes. Like we should see effects earlier for the states that are repealed earlier, and later for those other states. Yeah. And we shouldn't see differences between those states before the law change. As well.
Right.
Yes.
Interesting.
But I guess to sort of go back to like, why is this happening? I think this is something where like the paper's more speculative on. So we sort of looked at like social connections, like were those changing? Were you sort of less likely to socialize with your friends and relatives? That didn't seem to change as much. We did see sort of increases in, not in like safe drinking, like did you go to the bar with your friends? Did you like occasionally drink? But we did see increases in like self-reported like unsafe drinking. Did you like drink more than you should and things like that? So potentially this is a story about purpose and like identity and like something like that, or just this for many Americans, this is one of the most frequent sort of social interactions you have, sort of like a large part of your community. And if suddenly like your friends stop showing up, or sort of you stop showing up, potentially that would have sort of long-term consequences.
Yeah. It's interesting to think, I mean, and again, I don't want to extrapolate too far from your data, but just having done some work in this area myself, where you look at the proliferation of choice, just generally, and the way that tends to fragment people and create this ongoing desire for more, right? Like we've all heard of FOMO, right? The fear of missing out, right? And so it almost creates this underlying anxiety where I'm not doing what I should be doing or what I could be doing. There's so many other things I could be doing right now, and I'm not able to do them or what have you. It just feels like that would tie in somehow, but I'm reading your article. Obviously there weren't like empirical results that would suggest that, but it just feels like that's part of the context that we're creating with some of these things. And that what you guys are showing with these blue law repeals is that without certain restraints, unhindered choice may not be the best move for all of us. I could at least say that. This paper is sort of less like specific about this, but I agree with that general concept. Like, in general, like, there's papers that if you like, have the default to be to save more for retirement, people are happier with that 10, 20 years later than if you say, free choice, do whatever you'd like. And there's, this whole field of economics on like, just people have, their present selves and they have future selves, and they're often in conflict, and like sort of, maybe the best thing for your future self would be to like invest in your social network and your friendships. But the best thing for your current self is to like, stay home today and relax. Right.
And yes, so like that, potentially like is a dynamic that's going on in this setting. as well.
Do you, again, you mentioned that people didn't spend less time with their families and friends after these blue laws were taken out.
Mm-hmm.
And that there really seemed to be something about being in a local religious community that was holding these other things back. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's sort of a fair statement by elimination. So it's like it's like we didn't have like there. So this is using sort of survey data on like, what did you do? Like, did you go to church, etc.? Did you socialize with your friends? And we sort of didn't see change in these socialization outcomes. We do see people like attending church less, but that doesn't seem to sort of spill over into their like, do you socialize with like friends, neighbors, relatives, things like that. And so there's the question of sort of like what else is going to church besides sort of going to your bowling league. One aspect of it is this sort of like identity and sense of maybe purpose that it provides.
Did you at all think about it, or do you have any thoughts on church or religious community as constraint? So, you have the blue laws that are constraining retail, and they're eliminating those as choices, but most religious communities are going to have loose sets of rules.
Yeah.
In yes. Probably in the best case, right? And sort of a prototypical understanding of what an ideal congregant is going to be, let's say. And there's going to be these sets of attributes that tend to guide people within that environment and say, yeah, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that. So in addition to giving that sense of purpose, it also does sort of box you in a bit more.
Yes. I think that is like a potential story as well that like could be going on. It's not like the one results we have sort of on this screen is that like people are not like drinking more casually. So there's a sense of like, oh, like, we don't approve of like alcohol in general. It's not that like people are like loosely weakening that constraint, but there's a lot of other sort of constraints that sort of, have some costs, have some benefits, that people might be sort of behaving differently without sort of that, weekly reminder of those social norms.
And it doesn't seem like, because I don't want to overread this, but it doesn't seem like, let's say I go to my bowling league instead of going to church and I have a few beers, and then all of a sudden I have a few more beers when I get home and I have a few more beers after that. And this leads to one of the deaths of despair, which is, the sort of alcohol liver syndrome kind of thing. It's not that straight a line is what I'm hearing from you. It's more like there are going to be, who was it? Was it Pincus Khan? I don't think it was Pincus Khan. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he wrote the Tyranny of Small Decisions, kind of back in the late 70s. Are you familiar with that at all? Okay.
Anyway, I like the title. It's catchy. Yeah.
Yeah. He basically said, he's like, we're all making these small decisions all the time, and we're not thinking about the long-term consequences of those small decisions. And at some point down the line, we'll look back and go, man, I kind of wish I hadn't made that small decision back there, because look where it's led me. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just sort of wondering, when you think about it from an economic perspective, how do you really think about these? Obviously, changing the blue laws doesn't seem like that big of a deal. I mean, honestly, it doesn't.
No, and it's sort of, there's other evidence that like retail owners were sort of on both sides of, should we do this? Should we not do this? People mostly sort of reallocated their shopping across different days. It wasn't like now people are like buying more, and this is like a huge change to the American economy, or to that state's economy. No, but I think this is all sort of like one of the things that economists love to do is sort of try to think about like these unintended consequences. Like nobody who was thinking about, should we repeal the blue laws was thinking, maybe, because also like this was in the 70s and 80s, like Oxycontin wasn't a thing.
Right.
And actually, I think that's I think one thing I really want to like highlight about this paper is that this is about sort of the very early increase in death to despair that occurred before a lot of, before OxyContin was on the market,
the opioid crisis,
yes,
and those kind of
yes.
things.
And,
yeah.
I think there is now very convincing evidence that, like, you know, Purdue Pharma and like the availability of opioids, like that these massively exacerbated these deaths of despair.
Gotcha.
And so, like, this paper is not saying at all, you know, people should just be religious and then we don't
Exactly.
need to, you know, worry about Purdue and various opioid formulations. It's saying that, like, even before all of this, something was changing in like mortality, particularly for these sort of middle-aged, low-educated Americans. Something was changing, and it occurred the same time that religious affiliation was changing for this group as well. So, like, what maybe connects those two, and then you add in all of these, you know, other situations factors that just, you know, make this much worse.
How do you think so my background's in theology, right? So we get to play without a lot of empirical data most of the time, right? We stay in, you know, in the theoretical side. And so statistics, my eyes just kind of gloss over. But when you're thinking about it from this level and you're actually trying to figure out those, you know, statistically significant connections and correlations, how do you do a multivariate analysis like that, where you sit back and say, okay, we've noticed this trend with the blue laws, and we've seen this, and this is really a cool correlation, and there's obviously something happening here. Do you go back in and study that same period and ask yourself, well, what if we look now at this factor? Do we see that correlated in the same way? What does that look like to do those things?
That's a great question. So it's like, you know, we're wondering, does sort of change in religion affect despair? There's 100 other things that sort of could be going on.
Right.
Okay. It's a good question. It's a trickier question. So what we do in this paper is basically like build this evidence that, like, these things are related in time. They're affecting the same groups of people. So it's like these middle-aged, low-educated groups that are like experiencing this decline in religion and these increase in deaths of despair. We look at it at the state level, states that sort of had greater decrease in religiosity, had greater increases in deaths of despair. And then the third part of the paper is like looking at these like blue laws and arguing that, like, the states that had these laws have bigger things than anything else. So you're basically just building this evidence. And the comparison group is like, would we expect, you know, these relationships to occur randomly? And then the tricky thing, so, like, you know, we get the result that, like, you know, there's a very small chance this would occur randomly just by, like, you know, this correlation is like strong enough that's unlikely to occur randomly. The tricky thing that you point out is and maybe this is tell me if this is what you're saying.
Yeah.
There's 100 things that could affect deaths of despair.
Right.
We test them all. We're going to get 5 of them that pop out.
Yeah.
As statistically significant. So, you know, if I was a very bad economist, I would test 100 things. I would find 5 of them, and I write those 5 papers. I would publish them, etc. Okay. Hopefully that's not what people do. There is, I mean, of course, like, to some extent, you know, this, you know, economists respond to incentive, like things like that.
Sure.
How do you, the way that I think about this is like, there's a handful of, like, you want to sort of pre-specify what you're going to, like, consider.
Understood.
Beforehand. Yeah. Ideally, you, like, we all as economists would get together and specify, like, these are our top 10 things we're going to have to test them. Going into this, I think this prior that social ties and community and for many Americans, that is religion, might have something to do with, health and mortality. Seems like a compelling hypothesis, like bowling alone and all of these. It's a really strong correlation.
Yes.
So that's why we looked at this one as opposed to any of the 99 other ones. That's not to say, some of the 99 other ones, I think, are part of the story. Like Oxycontin is probably number one.
Availability of these things has to factor in.
Yes. And ours is maybe, number 4 or 5 or somewhere in that ranking. And I guess based on our priors and other people's priors, this seems like a reasonable hypothesis to test. Is that what your question was?
It is. Okay. Yeah. So, because I think what I'm trying to figure out is when we go back and look at this practically, right, there's a knee-jerk reaction that would say, well, this is an easy solve. Just reinstitute the blue laws.
Oh,
right. The simple, but I mean, and I'm saying that's the knee jerk, simplified reading of what you did. You'd say, well, we need to go back to that same constraint, but that's probably not going to work because at this point, we've got so many other factors around us that returning to that point and saying, oh, if we just put this back in place, everything will be fantastic, probably isn't what's going to happen. We've gone from arguably across that period again. So I grew up in that period. So I never had, for instance, games scheduled on a Sunday morning. If we had a soccer game or something like that I was going to play, it was always in the afternoon. And so you preserve that time for church, before that time. That's not on the books law. That was just sort of my experience of it. Things weren't scheduled over the top of church. You didn't travel anywhere near as much for sports teams. That didn't come in until I was close to out of high school, that started happening. And so you've got all these other things to sort of glob on now that just reinstituting one thing isn't going to work. And so, I'm just trying to think through, as you think about your work here and you think about practical solutions for folks that you're kind of sitting back saying, what does this really mean on the ground for people? Or if you were going to inform on policy, what does this really look like?
It's a great question. I think one of the other, this is, okay, I'll start with my cop-out answer, which is that most economists, and I'm myself included, I see my role as providing information and data and being if we did this, this would have these consequences. Right. If it did this. And then, politicians, voters can decide what set of preferences they would prefer. My job is to put numbers to these counterfactuals. My preferences are just one of 350 million. So that's the common answer, is that
fair enough. Yeah, totally fair.
That's sort of where I see our role ending. In the more exciting scenario where I have some control over policy, yes, I don't see sort of adding constraints to people as being a popular thing to do.
Right.
In general, people don't like soda taxes. They don't like, any, forced Social Security savings. Right. No one likes being told what to do. Even though, it might be, better in the long run. So yes, so this, and of course, it gets, a little bit, you can't say we're going to have Sunday mornings off in sort of a multi-religion, environment. But I do think from sort of a more personal perspective, I think this does make me consider, okay, I want to make time for these long run connections and things that are important to me, even though it might be sort of inconvenient in the short run. And then maybe there's more. So for example, we have a community center in our neighborhood. It does a lot of wonderful, pottery and dance, all these sorts of things. And sort of maybe there's some more policy funding support for
understood
things that would connect people.
Yeah, so it feels like it does at this point, at least, and this is what I would just, again, having read through this and understood the connection with the blue laws, I find that really interesting, but also recognizing there's no chance of going back, right?
Yeah,
there's
people
not
want
to
to buy
right.
milk on Sundays. That's what people want. Yeah.
And so it feels like it does ratchet down at least one level, if not two, maybe both, to an organizational level where it falls to really like the places we work to be thinking through the implications that your article has. How is it that we give now people time? How could we free up for our employees this space where they could choose to go do this? And then on an individual level, how do we, as individuals, start to choose things that are better for us rather than worse for us? And then, as you said, how do we fund some of these social organizations within a given community so that when organizations actually get on board with this, then people have the ability to choose those? Like, there has to be something there. And yeah, it's just a really interesting sort of, once the laws are repealed, putting them back in place sort of probably isn't going to happen. But you do see some of this navigation even in policy nowadays. Like, I don't know, I think you could find an analogy in something like parental time off after kids, those kind of things. Like, you can see some of these pieces where people are trying to poke this bear, but certainly not going back to what you describe in your article.
Yeah. I like that additional angle you added where there's sort of, you can, individual choices you can make. There's sort of like funding choices, and they're also like your work potentially could.
Yeah.
And there's some, more research now on, can people be just as productive in a 4-day work week as in a 5-day work week? And sort of, I think you're posing this interesting question of like, if you put some like no email on weekends policy, long run, might that be better for your employees? Potentially, I think that's an interesting, and like creative way of like approaching that. One tricky thing with that is like, these are longer run benefits. And so, if you're a happier, more productive person, then you leave my firm. That's annoying for me, who has invested in, all of these beautiful email-free weekends you just had. So like the incentives somewhat work better on like a larger scale. But of course it's sort of harder to get everyone to agree on what to do on a larger scale as well. It
is interesting. I mean, I go to Germany periodically. I've been over there a number of different times. And I remember the first time I was ever there and I tried to go to the store on a Sunday. And
Gotcha.
It's like, there's very little open. I mean, you could find a place, but it was not easy, and you had to work hard for it.
Mm-hmm.
And you just sort of look at that and you're like, well, Germany is a pretty modern nation. They're I don't know whether it's a law. I didn't like look into that. I assume it is.
Mm-hmm.
But it could also just be the choice of specific retailers to start coordinating and saying, we're just not going to be open here, or only some of us are going to be open here. And, we're going to manufacture this break.
Yeah. And I mean, and the trains run on time in Germany. So like they seem to be doing fine without their shopping. But you mentioned, I think, a very key thing, which is coordination. Like if I'm the only shop open on Sunday, no one is going shopping. No one's going to come to my store because no one expects it. So then I might as well close and like enjoy the day with my family as well. If everyone's open, I'm losing out on business, things like that. So it's sort of, maybe everyone would love to coordinate on something, but that's hard to do in the absence of more societal regulations. Yeah.
I'm wondering what, you said you're into health-based sort of economics. Mm-hmm. And so as you look at this study, my mind went very particular places, like the effects of remote work. I've been working remote since 2018, mm-hmm. and I'm starting to feel the wear and tear of it, quite frankly. I mean, it's taken a while, but, there are days when I don't leave my house and I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I built a gym in my house. I've got, I work out of my house. My family's in my house. Like, we have groceries delivered. I'm like, I've essentially eliminated any sort of social interaction that I could possibly have during a day. And I'm wondering, it just seems like that would be an interesting area to sit back and say, this is obviously going to cause problems. And it just feels like it almost has to, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, especially across the sort of tenure distribution. So there's some interesting papers on remote work. I'll send you some details, but like I think one of the findings is that it's like, especially the younger you are in your career, the sort of the worse it is because
harder it would be.
Like,
makes sense.
You benefit from all these informal connections, and then there's benefits, of course. You can spend more time with your family. I think it increases women in the workforce, but then there's some of these longer run costs, especially if you think very long term in terms of like the trajectories of young people and are they going to get the mentorship that they need. This makes me think one policy that I think is some of bad policy. My husband's firm, which I won't see what they are, they had a return to office policy only for the junior employees, and the senior people all stayed home. And you're like, well, the benefit would be to talk with these people. So.
No, it's just interesting. I mean, I think as an entailment of your research, you kind of look at this and you can start to draw, like you get a vibe off of the paper, right? Where there's a sense in which this correlation that you've described, it shouldn't be applied just to everything, right? So I want to avoid saying, hey, just apply this to everything. It's a general principle now. And we could, this will solve all the problems. It won't. But at the same time, there have to be these other trends that you're looking at and going, my gosh, we're exacerbating what appears to be a real problem here. And so remote work came to my mind, but I'm wondering if there are any others for you.
Oh, I mean, just in terms of like any metric of socialization has like dramatically fallen in the past few decades. And I think the decline of religiosity was sort of one of the early ones. So you see in like the late 80s, early 90s, religious attendance and affiliation just sharply dropped in the United States. But then just like, the share of teenagers who like socialize or like, and things like that has like also changed a lot more. So like, I think there's natural connections to like social media and like online versus in person connections. And then those are things that like I don't think this paper speaks to directly at all, but I'd be curious, to
look at next kind of
channels don't apply there as well. Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the last thing I don't know whether you have any thoughts on this at all. So feel free to say, no, I haven't really thought through that. But, part of my interest is in what could the church do, right? So it's one of these organizations that can actually provide some community, that can actually provide some things. But I would also just say, I'm a realist, right? Church isn't like the place you go to have a lot of fun, necessarily. It's enjoyable, but it's in that sort of,
not too fun.
I have a degree of contentment while I'm here, but it's not like a rock concert, So any thoughts or anything out of the data, maybe that wasn't even included in the paper, that you'd suggest that, as a church is looking at this and saying, wow, okay, you've got these deaths of despair, and whether our people are, dying is a separate question. But there are some things that we could do to build back in a sense of community, a sense of purpose, a sense of what have you, that maybe we're not doing now.
I think my first reaction to this, as someone who has spent no time thinking about what various religious leadership should do, but happy to offer opinions. Is I think almost everyone is lonely.
Yeah.
And if there's some, like I think anything that makes connecting with other people easier might be helpful in that regard. I'm trying to. This is a very, very sort of more specific to my situation. But we have a toddler, and then we're having another kid soon. But just like, if there's so many times in life where maybe you could sort of meet people that have sort of the similar problems as you at that time, and to the extent that like these groups are well positioned to make those connections, I think might be helpful.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then I guess last question.
I want more daycare at churches. Maybe that's my
listen. That's fair.
Fair.
I mean,
that's my only policy proposal.
Honestly, I think churches have figured that out. Children's ministry has become kind of a big thing since like nobody wants to. I mean, I remember sitting in church when I was a kid. I was horrible.
No one wants that. Yeah.
No one wants to do that anymore, and there's no tolerance for children in service. So, no, I totally get that. I'm wondering about if you saw anything. I know you're doing sort of a big macro analysis, but I'm wondering if you saw anything that would suggest why people chose to go to drugs, to alcohol, to suicide. In other words, you've got this plethora of choices about you. What was it about those three things that caused the increase in deaths of despair that just made sense to folks? Any insight in that, or is it just sort of?
I think that's where I'd have to say I don't.
Okay.
I think at that point, I don't think there's sort of a rational reason for that, and so then we sort of rely on,
but it wasn't like you said, the opioid increase and that kind of stuff was well beyond the time of the study, right? Did I understand that correctly?
This study, yes. So actually, if you look at these deaths of despair for this like middle-aged group, you see it's been declining over the 70s and 80s, and starting in the 90s, it starts to go. And that's the part that we start like, why is this increasing?
Right.
What's in the news now is like, why is it exponentially growing? And that's, I think, a more structural like availability issue. But why did it sort of start to increase there is I think maybe where this paper can come in. But I think there's a lot of, remaining questions. And I think one of them is like, what is the sequence of steps in between A and B?
Yeah. It's a really interesting trend. I mean, I found it fascinating to see this correlation that you all paint there, because it is sort of fascinating. And I think it connects so much with a lot of the things that I work with conceptually, but don't really have that empirical basis to it necessarily. You're just kind of looking at it and going, this seems like it's happening. Is it really happening? All-cause mortality has been increasing for the past few decades, and it's we'd love to reverse that. It would be nice, right? So what's next on the horizon for you? Like, what's your next big research that you're involved in, just out of curiosity?
So I'm a health economist, like quite broadly. One thing I'm working on now is newborn blood screenings. And specifically, I mentioned this question of like, what happens when you get a false positive for one of those things. So for most of these screenings, if you sort of pass this first flag, you don't actually have this serious condition. You don't actually have cancer or whatever. And sort of thinking about sort of quantifying the additional spending or sort of any sort of costs and benefits of that.
Gotcha.
The paper I'm actively working on now. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, it's a fascinating field, and
really
it's
appreciate. A lot broader than I think people think. Yeah.
No, definitely. Econ 101 did not give me the sense that this was what it was about. So
shame on that.
And I do remember reading Kahneman and going, "How is this economics?" But I just enjoyed his book, and so I just kept reading. It wasn't big.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for being on the show today. This is helpful. And the article actually is available online. So I'm going to link it in the show notes.
Great.
And so people can read through it if they'd like. And I appreciate you being on. This was an interesting topic, and just really enjoyed the paper and found it interesting. So thanks.
Great. Yeah. I enjoyed talking to you. So thank you for the good questions. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. Well, we'll call it a day there. And thanks for being here. Thanks for being listening to the episode. And we'll catch you on the next one. Thinking Christian. Take care. Just want to take a second to thank the team at Life Audio for their partnership with us on the Thinking Christian podcast. If you go to lifeaudio.com, you'll find dozens of other faith-centered podcasts in their network. They've got shows about prayer, Bible study, parenting, and more.
Are you concerned about tensions in the Middle East? Do you wonder where we're currently at in the biblical timeline? Are we really in the last days? Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Carl Muller with the Inside the Epicenter podcast. Every week, my co-host, best-selling author Joel Rosenberg and I answer those questions and more. You'll hear inside knowledge of our meetings with leaders at the highest levels of government in the U.S., Israel, and the Middle East, equipping you to filter the news with biblically sound insights. Find Inside the Epicenter on your favorite podcast app or go to joshuafund.com to listen and subscribe.